Hello, today I want to talk to you about anthropology. My name is Dr. Marcy Littlefield, and this is our first lesson in the Introduction to Anthropology. Anthropology is a study of humans. It's a study of the full scope of human diversity, and what anthropologists really do is really try to understand who people are, what makes people different, and in a way to really understand each other to make society better. Anthropology came out of the 19th century. What we saw was a lot of scholars and people were traveling to different parts of the world. They saw different types of people. And a lot of those travel diaries and their accounts really helped us to understand and helped them to understand at that time how different people were. And at that point, they started thinking about why different societies were different, what made those societies different, and they constructed different stages of cultural progress. They wanted to try to explain cultural differences. So they started off thinking about people in terms that we now think of as really being barbaric to think about people in that way. But it was this whole way of now going from thinking about people as being savages, barbarianism, and then what moved cultures to civilization. And so this is just the beginning of how anthropology is born. There are a lot of theories on exactly when it was actually born, but the different views on whether, and also different views on whether it's a natural science or it's humanity. Today is clearly considered to be a social science because it really crosses over a lot of disciplines. It's really interdisciplinary in a lot of ways because a lot of aspects of psychology, history, sociology, and philosophy are part of anthropology. Elements of it can be traced all the way back as far as the Greeks in 5 BCE. And then, of course, because there was a lot of travel going on in the early parts of the world, missionaries and explorers and philosophers were all exploring and now thinking about the world, thinking about society and the people that lived in that world. And they all contributed to what we now have as a discipline as anthropology. Charles Darwin was a big part of this. He was responsible for evolutionary theory. He argued that plants and animals evolved through time under the process called natural selection. Charles Darwin also talked about how organisms are really more alike than they are different. And he really talked about how you've probably heard about natural selection, but he really talks about in the context of what makes organisms similar to each other. And then we saw a lot of other evolutionary theories that came about. Lewis Henry Morgan argued that European civilization was the pinnacle of human evolutionary progress, and in his view, Europe represent humanity's highest biological, moral, and technological advancement. We'll talk more about some of these theories and how these theories translated into social life, but that became one way of thinking about how different societies and cultures progress over time. Sir Edward Taylor attempted to describe the development of different types of customs and beliefs that he found across many cultures. He took a more humanistic view to think about cultures in their context. And then Frank Boas, who is considered to be the father of cultural anthropology, he advocated the theories that there's no pure race and no race is superior to another. And so he gave a more holistic way of thinking about societies. Durkheim is the father of a school of anthropology called functionalism. When he talked in this way, he talked about functionalism was a way to think about how cultural institutions are part of the societies in which they live in. And functionalism was a way of understanding how all the different parts of society really influence culture. And so he really just talked about just the whole context of how culture and society are both very connected. And then we get to Stewart, Rapport, and Harris, who also begin to study how culture and social institutions relate to each other. And relate to how people use technology, what the economy looks like, what the natural environment looks like. And this approach is called cultural material. Now, again, Frank Boas, this class is centered on cultural anthropology. Boas came up with the holism perspective, and he took a really broad view of the historical and cultural foundations of behavior rather than just looking at biology, which is what the prior scholars did. And his perspective, he viewed culture as an integrated whole, that when you look at culture, you can't understand culture without looking at the whole, without considering the whole society in which people live in. And he talked about the way that this perspective allowed the interconnections amongst different factors that really contributed to human life is part of how we understand people. That you have to look at where people come from, what the society looks like, and how everything is connected to each other. So in this holistic perspective really helped us to ground a lot of the four fields of anthropology: archaeological, cultural, linguistic, and physical anthropology. So when we think about just this whole way in which anthropology started and how it's been transformed over time, there's a 19th century cultural evolution. Boas is centered in this, in the American cultural historicism, to think about how societies look at different groups of people and how culture influences that. He was against evolutionists. He was anti-racist. He looked at cultural relativism as a way of thinking about society. And he really spent a lot of time thinking about fieldwork and how you have to really go into different societies to understand culture in a way that you just can't, in a way that people hadn't done before. And then, of course, functionalism, this whole way of thinking about how all the parts of society work together to actually inform everything about the individual, including culture. And so this whole way of thinking about structural functionalism and thinking about how all the parts of society really benefit society as a whole. And that when we think about society, there's certain things help society function better, and certain things help make society very dysfunctional. And so this is a very, functionalism is a way of thinking about, it is a macro level perspective, which looks at society as a whole and doesn't look at just individual parts. It looks at the whole thing to try to understand culture and try to understand the people who live in that society. And then Mead comes along. He was a psychologist, right? And he looked at culture, personality. He looked at how really, when you think about society and even gender, he talked about how it's not just biologically constructed, it's also socially constructed. And then, of course, again, some of the neo-evolutionists looked at cultural ecology, and then cultural materialism, which looks at just the way in which science plays a part in it. So some of the key takeaways for anthropology is that it focuses on culture. It's a holistic perspective. It's comparative. It looks at cultural change. It looks at the way society is globalized. It's holistic. It looks at the fact that culture is intangible. It is, they say culture like elephants. You can't necessarily describe it without understanding how their parts all fit together, right? And so, and thinking about this holistic way that culture can't be separated from the society it is a part of. It's comparative, right? Some cultures are still around today, and a lot of cultures cultures have been reconstructed, and that's a way of thinking about just how people have changed over time. And again, anthropology is a social science. When you think about social sciences examine human relationships. They're subdivided into different fields. Anthropology studies culture. Economics studies production and distribution of goods and services. And so when we think about just this whole overview of anthropology, there are different parts of anthropology. It is the study of human beings. It encompasses their biological, cultural, and social aspect, and it really seeks to understand the diversity of human experiences across time and space. And so some examples include cultural, linguistic, biological, archaeological, feminist, paleoanthropology, forensic, and urban anthropology. All these different ways help to understand the world. There are different ways and practices in which anthropology is used to study this, through participant observation, interviews, archival research, but generally by examining the past and the present, anthropologists aim to share light on the universal human condition. And they try to address questions about origin, development, and the way in which we're all